That night, sitting in my modest Disney resort room after my son's family abandoned me at Space Mountain and I had to spend $200 on a taxi back to the hotel, I opened my laptop and made a decision that would shock my entire family. Within 24 hours. David was frantically calling me after seeing my Instagram post from the Grand Floridian presidential suite, begging me to take down the viral video that showed me dining with Disney executives while explaining how his family had abandoned their 73-year-old mother at the Magic Kingdom. But by then, I'd already canceled the $25,000 Disney cruise I'd been secretly funding for their family bonding vacation, frozen the college funds I'd been contributing to for my grandchildren Emma and Lucas, and posted a follow-up video that had already been viewed 2.3 million times. Now Jessica wishes she'd never heard the words, "Just meet us back here later." David regrets choosing his wife's ride schedule over his mother's dignity. But me? I've never felt more powerful, and I've never enjoyed Mickey Mouse waffles more than I did this morning in the Cinderella Castle suite. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is going to make you rethink everything you know about family dynamics and the power of going viral for all the right reasons. And while you're at it, ring that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove age is not a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of understanding exactly how to make entitled people face consequences. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this question. Have you ever been treated like an inconvenience by the very people you've sacrificed the most for? Have you ever found yourself standing alone in a crowded place, wondering how the family you've supported financially and emotionally for years could simply walk away when helping you became slightly inconvenient? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stopped being the generous, accommodating person that everyone takes for granted? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences matter. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing when kindness becomes exploitation, and more importantly, how to reclaim your power when family members mistake your love for weakness. And if you've never experienced this kind of betrayal personally, stick around, because this story will show you exactly how to spot the warning signs before you find yourself in my situation. This story is about the Tuesday when I learned that 3 years of funding family vacations and unconditional love meant nothing when my presence became inconvenient for my son's family at the most magical place on earth. When I discovered that the child I'd raised to value family loyalty had married a woman who saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed around her perfectly planned Disney itinerary. But let me tell you something important before we dive into how I went from abandoned grandmother to viral sensation in less than 48 hours. This isn't a story about revenge, though I certainly got satisfaction from watching my son and daughter-in-law panic when they realized what they'd lost. This isn't about being vindictive, though the consequences I delivered were swift and decisive. This is about understanding that respect isn't optional in family relationships. It's the price of admission to the benefits that love and generosity can provide. My name is Margaret Catherine Sinclair, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 4 years, I'd been living independently in a beautiful senior community called Golden Oaks in Orlando, Florida, just 45 minutes from my son David and his family in Winter Park. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime home in Charleston, South Carolina. After my husband William's passing, I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Lucas, and be part of their lives in whatever way felt natural. But before I became the inconvenient grandmother who could be abandoned at Disney World when my presence became tiresome, let me tell you about the life I built and the resources I accumulated that would eventually become the foundation of my power to change everything. I was born Margaret Catherine O'Sullivan in 1951, the daughter of an Irish Catholic family in Savannah, Georgia, who believed that education, hard work, and taking care of family were the 3 pillars of a meaningful life. My father, Sean, worked as a supervisor at the Port Authority, while my mother, Bridget, managed our household of 4 children with the kind of precision and efficiency that would make a Fortune 500 CEO envious. Growing up in coastal Georgia during Mahdi, the 1950s and 60s taught me lessons that would serve me throughout my life, though I didn't understand their full value at the time. We lived in a modest 2-story house that my father had purchased with savings from 12 years of Port Authority work. A house that represented everything my parents had sacrificed to provide for their children's futures. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone looked out for everyone else's children, where favors were exchanged without keeping score, and where reputation was built through consistency and reliability rather than wealth or social connections. It was also a world where money was always carefully managed, where opportunities had to be earned through merit, and where planning for the future required strategic thinking about education and career choices. My parents had immigrated from County Cork in Ireland during the 1940s, arriving in Savannah with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would eventually allow them to purchase that house and send all 4 children to college. They'd met at a church dance for Irish immigrants, married after a courtship that lasted 3 years, while they both saved money and established themselves in their new country. Sean O'Sullivan had found work at the Savannah port within 2 months of arriving in America, starting as a general laborer and working his way up to supervisor through 12 years of showing up early, staying late, and treating every task as an opportunity to prove his value to supervisors who were initially skeptical about hiring recent immigrants. Bridget O'Sullivan had taken work as a seamstress for wealthy families in Savannah's historic district, creating beautiful clothing and doing alterations while learning English and observing how successful American families managed their households and raised their children. She'd saved every penny she could from her wages, living with relatives for the first 2 years, while accumulating the money that would eventually become the down payment on the house where I grew up. By the time I was old enough to understand adult conversations, my parents had achieved a level of financial security that allowed them to focus on their children's education and future opportunities, rather than basic survival. But they never forgot the lessons they'd learned during those early years of struggle, and they made sure their children understood that security was something that had to be earned and protected through careful planning and consistent effort. Margaret, my father would say when I complained about having to work part-time jobs during high school, money that you earn yourself is money that no one can take away from you. But money that you depend on other people to provide can disappear as quickly as it appeared. That lesson, that financial independence was the foundation of all other forms of independence, would shape every major decision I made throughout my adult life. It would influence my choice to continue working even after David was born, my insistence on maintaining my own investment accounts even during the years when William's income could have supported our entire family, and my careful planning for retirement that had allowed me to maintain my dignity and independence even after William's death. My mother's lessons were equally important, though focused more on relationships and family dynamics than money management. Bridget O'Sullivan had observed wealthy families long enough to understand that money alone didn't create happiness or security, and that the families who thrived over generations were those who maintained strong relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. Margaret, she would tell me as I helped her prepare dinner each evening, money can solve many problems, but it cannot solve the problem of people who don't love each other properly. The families I work for who are truly happy are the ones where everyone treats everyone else with kindness and consideration, regardless of who earns the money or who makes the decisions. That lesson, that respect and consideration were the foundation of healthy relationships, would become the standard by which I measured all my important relationships throughout my life. It would guide my expectations for marriage, my approach to raising David, and eventually, my recognition of when family relationships had become unhealthy enough to require intervention. I met my husband, William James Sinclair, when I was 26, and working as an executive assistant at Coastal Banking Corporation in Savannah. William was 29, a financial advisor with dreams of building his own investment firm, and helping middle-class families achieve the kind of financial security that had taken my parents decades to build. He was intelligent, ambitious, and had the rare quality of seeing potential in people and situations that others might overlook. What attracted me to William wasn't just his intelligence or his professional success, though both were impressive. What drew me to him was the way he listened when I talked about my family, my work, and my own dreams for the future. He was genuinely interested in my opinions about things that mattered to both of us, and he treated my goals and preferences as equally important to his own when we discussed the kind of life we might build together. During our 3-year courtship, William had demonstrated the qualities that would make him not just a good husband, but a true partner in building the kind of life that would honor both our family's sacrifices and our own dreams for the future. He was the kind of man who remembered what I'd told him about my family's history and my parents' struggles, and who understood that my commitment to financial independence wasn't distrust of his ability to provide for our family, but rather a reflection of values that had been shaped by my parents' experiences as immigrants who'd had to build security from nothing. When William proposed in March 1979, he did so with a speech that had convinced me he understood not just what I wanted from marriage, but why those things were important to me. "Margaret," he had said, "I want to build something with you that our children will be proud to inherit, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of the values and the love that will be the foundation of everything we create together." We married at Sacred Heart Cathedral in Savannah in a ceremony that represented everything hopeful about young love and careful planning. The wedding wasn't elaborate by today's standards, but it was perfect in the way that matters most. It was a celebration of two people who genuinely understood what they were promising each other and had the character to honor those promises through whatever challenges life might bring. The early years of our marriage had been challenging in the way that builds character, rather than destroying it. William's position as a junior financial advisor at Coastal Banking provided a steady but modest income, while my role as executive assistant at the same institution contributed enough to allow us to save for the future we were planning. We lived carefully, spending money on experiences and investments that would build our foundation rather than on luxuries that would provide temporary pleasure but no lasting value. But what made those early years special wasn't the financial discipline or the practical skills we were developing. It was the way we approached every decision as a team, with each person's opinions and preferences given equal weight in creating the life we were building together. When David was born in Tabor, 1982, William and I were ready for parenthood in all the ways that mattered. We had established ourselves financially. We had created a stable home environment, and we had developed the kind of partnership that would allow us to raise a child with consistent values and expectations, while also giving him the love and attention he would need to develop his own personality and interests. But even before David was born, William and I had been planning for the move to Florida that would eventually take us to Orlando. William had been offered a partnership position with Sunshine Financial Advisors, a growing firm that specialized in retirement planning for the increasing number of retirees choosing Florida as their permanent home. The opportunity represented everything we'd been working toward: a chance for William to build his own client base while creating the kind of financial security that would allow us to provide David with opportunities neither of us had enjoyed during our own childhoods. Decision to leave Savannah wasn't easy. It meant leaving both our extended families and the community connections that had provided security and familiarity throughout our young adult years. But William and I had spent months researching the opportunity and developing a plan that would allow us to pursue our professional goals while building the kind of family life that honored both our values about community, stability, and putting family relationships first. When we moved to Orlando in 1983, David was 18 months old, and I was pregnant with the hopes and dreams that would shape the next 30 years of our lives. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a new development called Meadowbrook Estates, where young families with children were creating the kind of neighborhood community that felt like a modern version of the close-knit Savannah neighborhoods we'd left behind. Orlando in 1983 was a city in transition, growing rapidly as Walt Disney World transformed Central Florida into a destination for families from around the world. William's career flourished as he built a client base of retirees and young families who needed sophisticated financial planning to navigate the opportunities and challenges of Florida's booming economy. I found fulfilling work as an administrative manager for Orange County Schools, which allowed me to maintain my career while having a schedule that aligned with David's educational needs. For the next 25 years, William and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the decision to leave Savannah. We paid off our mortgage early, built substantial investment portfolios, and created the kind of stable, loving home environment where David could develop his own personality and interests while being shaped by values that would serve him well. Throughout his life, David thrived in Orlando. He was an excellent student, a natural leader who excelled at debate team and student government, and had inherited his father's analytical thinking combined with my ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. He was popular without being arrogant, successful without being competitive with his friends, and had the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a wonderful young man the Sinclair family had raised. When David graduated from high school as valedictorian and received a full academic scholarship to University of Florida's business program, William and I felt like all our sacrifices and planning had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a son capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating his own version of success and happiness. During David's junior year at UF, he met Jessica Martinez, a communications major from a wealthy Tampa family who owned a successful chain of luxury car dealerships throughout Florida. Jessica was beautiful, intelligent, and came from the kind of established Florida family that could provide David with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path he chose to pursue. When David brought Jessica home, for the first time, I was immediately impressed by her confidence, her intelligence, and her apparent genuine affection for my son. She seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our move from Savannah, and expressed appreciation for the values that had shaped David's character. "I can see where David gets his integrity and his work ethic," Jessica had said during that first dinner. "You and Mr. Sinclair have raised someone really special." At the time, I'd treasured that comment as evidence that Jessica understood and valued what William and I had tried to accomplish as parents. Looking back now, I can see that Jessica was already demonstrating the skills she would later use to manipulate family dynamics, the ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear, while privately calculating how their relationships could be used to advance her own interests. The wedding took place 2 years later at the prestigious Grand Bohemian Hotel in Orlando, with 300 guests, flowers that cost more than William and I had spent on our entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in Orlando Magazine's society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that David had found love with someone who clearly adored him and who came from a family that would support his ambitions and help him build the kind of life he deserved. But even during the wedding planning process, there had been signs that I should have recognized as warnings about how Jessica viewed family relationships and social dynamics. Jessica's family had dominated the guest list, filling nearly 3/4 of the venue with their extensive social and business networks, while David's side had included William and me, a few college friends, some co-workers from his first job at an Orlando marketing firm, and several empty tables that highlighted the difference in our social circles compared to the Martinez family's extensive connections. During the reception, Jessica's mother, Carmen, had introduced me to other guests as David's mother, the school administrator, while she introduced her own family and friends with detailed descriptions of their business achievements, social positions, and community involvement. The introductions weren't intentionally dismissive, but they reflected a subtle hierarchy that positioned the Sinclair family as David's past, while the Martinez family represented his future. The first few years of David and Jessica's marriage had seemed to confirm my optimism. Jessica had been warm and inclusive, inviting William and me to family celebrations and holiday gatherings. She'd seemed genuinely grateful for my help during the early months of adjusting to married life, when managing a household while both partners were establishing their careers required the kind of support that experienced family members could provide. When Emma was born 3 years after the wedding, Jessica had actively sought my advice about everything from sleep schedules and feeding routines to managing the anxiety that came with first-time parenthood. I had spent countless hours helping with the kind of practical support that made the transition to parenthood manageable: meal preparation, laundry, and the overnight care that allowed new parents to get enough rest to function during the demanding early months. "Margaret, I don't know what I'd do without you," Jessica had said repeatedly during Emma's infancy. "Having an experienced mother nearby has made this so much easier than it would have been if we were trying to figure everything out on our own." When Lucas had arrived 3 years later, the pattern had repeated, with me providing intensive support. During the challenging months of adjusting to life with 2 young children, Jessica had seemed genuinely appreciative of my help, and David had regularly expressed gratitude for his mother's willingness to prioritize their family's needs. William's death 6 years ago had changed everything about my situation and my relationship with David's family. William had been my partner, my best friend, and my buffer in social situations where I felt uncertain about family dynamics or social expectations. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep from a heart attack at age 71, I lost not just my husband, but also my primary source of emotional support and my strongest advocate within our family structure. The grief was overwhelming, but David and Jessica had been wonderfully supportive during those first difficult months. They'd helped with funeral arrangements, assisted with legal and financial paperwork, and had included me in family activities in ways that made me feel like I was still part of a loving, connected family unit, even without William's presence. When I'd decided to sell the Meadowbrook Estates house, the house held too many memories, and maintaining it alone felt overwhelming. David had suggested that I consider moving closer to their family rather than staying isolated in a house that was too large and too filled with reminders of my loss. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone during this transition," David had said as we'd discussed my housing options. "Orlando has some beautiful senior communities where you could have your own space, but also access to social activities and support services. And being closer to us would mean you could be part of Emma and Lucas's daily lives in whatever way feels comfortable." Golden Oaks had seemed perfect when David and Jessica had toured it with me. The apartment was spacious and elegant, with 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a balcony overlooking the community's beautifully landscaped gardens and golf course. The complex offered social activities, transportation services for shopping and appointments, and the kind of security that would give David peace of mind about my safety and well-being. Most importantly, the location was only 45 minutes from David and Jessica's home in Winter Park, close enough for regular visits and family involvement, but far enough that I wouldn't be interfering with their daily routines or privacy. The sale of my Meadowbrook Estates house had netted $485,000 after paying off the small remaining mortgage and covering real estate fees. Instead of keeping all that money for my own future needs, I'd given $200,000 to David and Jessica as what I'd called an early inheritance to help them upgrade to their dream home in Winter Park and fund some renovations they'd been planning. The remaining $285,000 I'd kept in savings and investment accounts to cover my living expenses at Golden Oaks and provide financial security for my remaining years. But what David and Jessica didn't know was that William's financial planning and investment strategies had been extraordinarily successful. The portfolio he'd built over 30 years of disciplined investing had grown to over $2.3 million by the time of his death. Combined with his life insurance policies and our other assets, I had become a woman of considerable means, though I'd chosen to live modestly and use my resources to help my family rather than display my wealth conspicuously. At the time, Giving David and Jessica the majority of my house sale proceeds had seemed like a generous way to help secure their families' financial future while ensuring that I wouldn't be seen as a financial burden on their household. David had been grateful, Jessica had been gracious, and I'd felt good about contributing to the beautiful home where I would spend time with my grandchildren and be part of their family celebrations. What I didn't understand was that my financial contribution would eventually be reframed as my choice, rather than acknowledged as the generous gift that had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. What I didn't anticipate was that Jessica would begin to see my presence in their lives as an obligation they'd inherited, rather than a blessing they'd chosen to embrace. For the first 2 years after moving to Golden Oaks, the arrangement had worked exactly as David had promised. I maintained my independence while being available to help with Emma and Lucas when needed. I contributed to family celebrations, provided occasional babysitting that allowed David and Jessica to have date nights, and enjoyed the kind of grandmother role that enriched everyone's lives without creating burden or obligation. But somewhere during the 3rd year, my helpfulness had transformed from appreciated contribution to expected service. The thank yous had become less frequent. The consideration for my own schedule and preferences had become non-existent. The assumption that I would be available whenever needed had become absolute, while the reciprocal consideration for my own needs and limitations had disappeared entirely. Jessica had begun making plans that assumed my availability without consulting me first. Date nights were scheduled with the expectation that I would provide childcare, even when I had my own social activities or appointments planned. Shopping trips and family outings were organized around Jessica's schedule, with my transportation needs treated as an afterthought that could be managed with last-minute arrangements. Most telling of all, Jessica had begun making comments about my living situation that suggested she was already anticipating changes to our current arrangement. Comments about how independent I was becoming, observations about how well I was adjusting to life at Golden Oaks, and casual mentions of friends whose elderly parents had thrived after moving to higher care facilities that provided more appropriate levels of social interaction and support. The Disney World trip had been planned as a family bonding vacation, a week-long celebration of Emma's 10th birthday that would create magical memories for the grandchildren while allowing the adults to enjoy the parks together. Jessica had suggested the trip 6 months earlier, and I had immediately offered to help with the expenses since Disney vacations can be prohibitively expensive for young families. "We want this to be special for the kids," Jessica had said when we'd discussed the trip. "But between the hotel, park tickets, meals, and everything else, it's going to cost more than we can comfortably afford right now." I had quietly arranged to pay for the entire trip, $25,000 for a week at the Grand Floridian Resort, park hopper tickets for everyone, meal plans, and all the extras that would make the vacation truly magical for Emma and Lucas. I hadn't told David and Jessica the full extent of my contribution, allowing them to believe I was just helping out, rather than funding the entire vacation. The plan had been for all of us to enjoy the parks together, with me taking a more relaxed pace while David and Jessica managed the more intense rides and activities that the children wanted to experience. I was looking forward to seeing Emma and Lucas experience the magic of Disney World, while spending quality time with my family in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. But what I discovered on that terrible Tuesday was that Jessica had been planning all along to use me as convenient babysitting service while she and David enjoyed the parks on their own schedule. The family bonding vacation I'd funded had actually been designed as a couples retreat with built-in childcare provided by the grandmother who'd been generous enough to pay for the entire experience. That morning, as we'd entered Magic Kingdom together, Jessica had handed me a detailed itinerary that divided the day into time slots, where I would be responsible for Emma and Lucas, while she and David rode attractions that were too intense for the kids, or attended experiences that were more appropriate for adults. "We'll meet back here at 2 p.m., Jessica had said, pointing to a bench near Space Mountain. The kids want to do the Dumbo ride and some of the Fantasyland attractions, which are perfect for grandparent time. David and I will knock out some of the bigger rides while you're having fun with Emma and Lucas. What followed was 4 hours of me attempting to keep up with 2 energetic children while navigating crowds, standing in lines, and managing their needs in the Florida heat. Emma and Lucas were wonderful, but they were children with boundless energy and excitement who needed constant supervision and attention. Meanwhile, my phone battery had died somewhere between Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion, leaving me unable to contact David and Jessica when the children became tired and cranky. By 2 p.m., when I arrived at our designated meeting spot with 2 exhausted grandchildren and aching feet of my own, David and Jessica were nowhere to be found. I waited for 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours, while Emma and Lucas asked, repeatedly, when their parents would return and why we couldn't go back to the hotel. At 4 p.m., with no word from David or Jessica and 2 increasingly upset children, I made the decision to take Emma and Lucas back to the hotel myself. The taxi ride cost $45, but what hurt more than the expense was the realization that my son and daughter-in-law had simply forgotten about me and the children in their excitement to enjoy the parks without responsibility. When we reached the Grand Floridian, I discovered David and Jessica in the lobby lounge, relaxing with drinks and discussing their afternoon while appearing completely unconcerned about the family members they'd left behind. "Oh, good. You made it back," Jessica had said when she saw us approaching. "We got caught up exploring Epcot and lost track of time." "The kids look tired anyway. They're probably ready for a nap." No apology. No acknowledgement that they'd left their mother and their children waiting for 2 hours. No recognition that abandoning family members at Disney World was unacceptable behavior, regardless of the circumstances. That evening, after Emma and Lucas had gone to bed in the adjoining room of our family suite, I'd tried to address what had happened with David and Jessica. I'd explained how frightening and degrading it had felt to be forgotten and abandoned, how difficult it had been to manage 2 tired children alone, and how their casual dismissal of the situation was hurtful and disrespectful. David's response had been the final straw. "Mom, I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. We were just trying to make the most of our vacation time. You know how rare it is for Jessica and me to get time together without the kids. But this wasn't their vacation. It was the vacation I had funded for our family to enjoy together. And the kids they needed time away from were the grandchildren. I'd spent 4 hours entertaining while they rode attractions and enjoyed adult beverages." That night, sitting alone in my hotel room after discovering that the family I'd generously supported for years could abandon me without a second thought, I made the decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began researching exactly how much power a woman with $2.3 million in assets and a viral social media strategy could wield when she finally decided to stop being taken for granted. Within 24 hours, David and Jessica would discover that the grandmother they'd dismissed as an inconvenience was actually the person who controlled whether their comfortable lifestyle continued or disappeared forever. The Disney vacation I'd funded would become the last family trip they'd ever take at my expense, and the Magic Kingdom would become the place where Margaret Catherine Sinclair transformed from accommodating grandmother to powerful woman who refused to accept disrespect from anyone, including her own family. But before I tell you exactly how I turned their dream vacation into their worst nightmare, let me show you the strategic thinking and hidden resources that made my response possible. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the most magical moments happen when you finally decide to stop letting other people's convenience matter more than your own dignity. Before we continue with Margaret's story and find out exactly how she transformed from abandoned grandmother to viral sensation in less than 48 hours, I need you to do something crucial for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not just because it helps the channel, but because what you're about to hear is going to fundamentally change how you think about family dynamics, financial power, and the art of strategic consequences. And while you're clicking that subscribe button, make sure you ring the notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove something most people never realize. Age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of watching people reveal their true character when they think you're powerless to respond. Now, I want you to pause this video for just a moment and really think about this question. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you've sacrificed for, supported financially, or helped repeatedly suddenly treated you like you were the inconvenience? Have you ever found yourself standing somewhere, whether it's a shopping mall, a family gathering, or even a place as magical as Disney World, wondering how the people you've loved and supported could simply walk away when helping you became slightly more effort than they wanted to make? I want you to really sit with that feeling for a moment, because if you've experienced it, you know exactly what Margaret felt that afternoon at Space Mountain. And if you haven't experienced it yet, consider yourself fortunate. But also consider this story a warning about the signs to watch for before you find yourself in Margaret's situation. Drop your answer in the comments below. Tell me about a time when someone treated your generosity like an obligation, your love like a convenience, or your presence like a burden they had to manage. I read every single comment, and your experiences matter because they're part of a pattern that plays out in families, friendships, and relationships all over the world every single day. But here's what I also want you to tell me in the comments. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Would you have quietly accepted the abandonment and tried to smooth things over to keep family peace? Would you have confronted David and Jessica directly and hoped they'd change their behavior? Or would you have done what Margaret did, recognized that some lines can't be uncrossed and decided it was time to teach some people exactly what they were about to lose? Because Margaret's story isn't just entertainment, and it's not just about one woman's response to being mistreated by her family. This is a masterclass in understanding when kindness becomes exploitation, when family obligation becomes family manipulation, and, most importantly, how to reclaim your power. When the people who should love you most start treating you like your feelings don't matter as much as their convenience. You see, what makes Margaret's story so compelling isn't just the dramatic outcome, though watching entitled people face consequences for their behavior is undeniably satisfying. What makes this story truly powerful is that it demonstrates principles that can transform how you handle every difficult relationship in your life, whether we're talking about family members, friends, colleagues, or anyone else who's been taking your kindness for weakness. Today's story is going to challenge some deeply held beliefs that many of us have about family loyalty and unconditional love. We're going to explore the difference between being supportive and being exploited, between being generous and being taken advantage of, between maintaining family harmony and enabling family dysfunction. And by the time we're finished, you're going to understand why Margaret's response wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was actually the most loving thing she could have done for people who had completely lost perspective on how relationships are supposed to work. But I want to be absolutely clear about something before we dive deeper into Margaret's story. This isn't about encouraging family conflict for its own sake. This isn't about promoting revenge as a solution to relationship problems. And this definitely isn't about cutting people off at the first sign of imperfection or selfishness. What this story is about is understanding that healthy relationships, whether they're with family members, friends, or romantic partners, require mutual respect. Not perfect behavior, not constant gratitude, not walking on eggshells to avoid conflict, but basic, fundamental respect for each other's dignity, feelings, and worth as human beings. Margaret's story demonstrates what happens when that respect disappears entirely, when one person's needs and feelings become completely irrelevant to the other people in the relationship, and when kindness and generosity get reframed as obligations rather than choices. More importantly, it shows us what's possible when someone who's been devalued finally decides that preserving their own dignity is more important than preserving an artificial peace. The reason Margaret's response was so effective wasn't because she was wealthy, though her financial resources certainly gave her options that not everyone has. The reason her response worked was because she understood something that most people in her situation never figure out. Respect isn't something you can beg for, negotiate for, or earn through increasingly desperate acts of service. Respect is something you have to require, and sometimes requiring respect means demonstrating exactly what life looks like when people lose access to the benefits they've been taking for granted. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but family is family. Shouldn't Margaret have tried to work things out? Shouldn't she have given David and Jessica another chance to understand how their behavior was affecting her? And those are fair questions that deserve honest answers. The reality is that Margaret had been trying to work things out for 3 years. She'd been giving David and Jessica chances to recognize how their behavior was changing, to acknowledge her feelings, and to treat her with the consideration that any human being deserves, let alone a mother and grandmother who'd been financially supporting their lifestyle. Margaret hadn't jumped straight to consequences. She'd started with conversations. She'd tried expressing her feelings directly. She'd attempted to address the problems through normal relationship communication. But what she'd discovered, what many people in similar situations discover, is that some people interpret attempts at communication as opportunities to explain why your feelings are wrong, rather than as information about how their behavior needs to change. When Margaret had tried to talk to David about feeling taken for granted, his response had been to minimize her feelings and make excuses for Jessica's behavior. When she'd expressed hurt about being excluded from family decisions, she'd been told she was being too sensitive. When she'd pointed out that her contributions were being treated as expectations rather than appreciated as choices, she'd been reminded of how much the family valued her without any acknowledgement that their behavior needed to change. This is a pattern that many of you will recognize from your own lives. It's what happens when someone has decided that your role in their life is to provide services, support, or resources while requiring minimal consideration in return. They're not necessarily conscious of making this decision. Often they've simply gotten comfortable with an arrangement that benefits them, and they've stopped thinking about whether it's fair to you. The insidious thing about this dynamic is that it usually develops gradually. It starts with small requests that seem reasonable. It progresses to larger expectations that build on previous generosity. Eventually, it reaches a point where your availability, your resources, and your emotional labor are simply assumed rather than requested, appreciated, or reciprocated. Margaret's situation with David and Jessica is a perfect example of how this progression works. It had started with Margaret offering to help with childcare during the stressful early months of parenthood, offering being the key word. These were choices Margaret made because she loved her family and wanted to support them during challenging transitions. But over time, Margaret's helpful choices had been reframed as grandmotherly obligations. Her generous financial contributions had been recontextualized as Margaret's decisions, rather than acknowledged as gifts that significantly improved David and Jessica's quality of life. Her presence in their lives had been repositioned from valued family member to convenient resource that could be utilized when beneficial and ignored when inconvenient. The Disney World abandonment hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It had been the inevitable result of 3 years of systematic devaluation that had finally reached the point where David and Jessica felt comfortable treating Margaret with open disregard rather than subtle manipulation. What's crucial to understand about Margaret's story is that the people who exploit kindness rarely see themselves as exploitative. David and Jessica didn't wake up one morning and decide to mistreat Margaret. Instead, they gradually adjusted their expectations and behaviors in response to Margaret's continued availability and generosity until they reached a point where they simply expected her to prioritize their convenience over her own dignity. This is why attempting to solve these problems through conversation alone is often ineffective. When someone has convinced themselves that your role is to accommodate their needs while they accommodate nothing in return, they're not usually open to feedback about how this dynamic is unfair. Instead, they're likely to respond to your concerns with explanations about why their needs are more important, why your expectations are unreasonable, or why you should be grateful for the opportunity to serve their family. Margaret had experienced exactly this type of response when she'd tried to address her concerns with David. Instead of acknowledgement that his mother's feelings mattered and his family's behavior needed adjustment, she'd received lectures about being more understanding of the challenges of parenting and marriage. Instead of recognition that abandoning her at Disney World was unacceptable, she'd been told she was making a bigger deal out of the situation than necessary. This type of response reveals something important about how David and Jessica viewed Margaret's role in their lives. They weren't interested in her feedback about their behavior because they didn't see her as someone whose opinions about their treatment of her mattered. They saw her as someone whose function was to provide support while accepting whatever level of consideration they felt like offering in return. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it explains why Margaret's strategic response was not only justified, but necessary. When someone has decided that your feelings don't matter enough to influence their behavior, communication alone will not restore respect to the relationship. What's required is a demonstration that treating you badly has consequences they care about more than they care about treating you well. Margaret's decision to upgrade her Disney experience and share her story publicly wasn't revenge. It was education. She was teaching David and Jessica something they'd apparently forgotten, that her presence in their lives was a choice she was making, not an obligation she owed them, that her financial support was generosity she was providing, not an entitlement they could expect regardless of how they treated her. And that respecting her dignity wasn't an optional extra in their relationship. It was the price of admission to the benefits she'd been providing. The brilliant thing about Margaret's approach was that it was completely proportional and entirely within her rights. She didn't do anything illegal, unethical, or even particularly harsh. She simply stopped providing benefits to people who demonstrated they didn't value the person providing them. She withdrew her financial support from people who'd shown they were willing to abandon her when her presence became slightly inconvenient. And she shared her experience publicly, not to shame them, but to demonstrate that seniors don't have to accept mistreatment just because the mistreatment is coming from family members. But Margaret's story also demonstrates something else that's crucial for anyone who's dealing with similar situations: the importance of having options. Margaret was able to respond strategically to David and Jessica's behavior because she had maintained her financial independence, because she'd preserved her own social connections and interests, and because she understood her own worth regardless of how her family was treating her. Too often, people find themselves trapped in exploitative relationships because they've allowed themselves to become completely dependent on the people who are mistreating them. They've given up their financial independence, isolated themselves from other relationships, or convinced themselves that maintaining family connections is worth accepting any level of disrespect. Margaret's story shows us a different model. She'd maintained her independence while being generous. She'd preserved her own identity while being supportive. She'd kept her options open while being available. This meant that when David and Jessica finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, Margaret had the resources and freedom to respond in ways that created real consequences for their behavior. For those of you who are currently in situations where you feel taken for granted by family members, friends, or others, Margaret's story offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The inspiration comes from seeing someone refuse to accept mistreatment just because it's coming from people she loves. The practical guidance comes from understanding how Margaret had positioned herself to have choices when those choices became necessary. If you're supporting someone financially, Maintain control over those resources rather than signing them over completely. If you're providing ongoing help or services, make sure they're appreciated rather than expected. If you're always the one accommodating, adjusting, or sacrificing, start requiring some reciprocity before resentment builds to levels that damage the relationship permanently. Most importantly, remember that teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel, it's necessary. People who truly care about you will adjust their behavior when they understand it's hurting you. People who don't care about you will resist that adjustment and try to convince you that your expectations are the problem. Margaret's story is ultimately about the power that comes from understanding your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't reflect that worth. It's about recognizing when kindness becomes enabling, when family loyalty becomes family exploitation, and when maintaining peace requires sacrificing so much of yourself that the peace isn't worth maintaining. The transformation we're about to witness, from abandoned grandmother to powerful woman commanding respect, didn't happen because Margaret became a different person. It happened because she finally decided to stop hiding how powerful she'd always been in deference to other people's comfort. But before we see exactly how Margaret executed her plan and watch David and Jessica realize what they'd lost, we need to understand more about the foundation Margaret had built over 7 decades of life experience. We need to see how a girl from Savannah, Georgia, had become a woman with the resources, connections, and strategic thinking necessary to completely reverse the power dynamics in her family relationships. Because Margaret's power didn't come from anger or vindictiveness. It came from a lifetime of making smart decisions, building valuable relationships, and understanding that respect is something you have to require rather than something you can hope other people will volunteer. The woman who opened her laptop that Tuesday night at Disney World wasn't just a hurt grandmother deciding to lash out at ungrateful family members. She was a strategic thinker with decades of experience dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness, someone who understood exactly how to demonstrate that actions have consequences, and someone who'd finally reached the point where teaching her family about respect had become more important than enabling their disrespectful behavior. Margaret Catherine Sinclair was about to show David and Jessica what happens when someone who's been underestimated decides it's time to reveal their true power. And by the time she was finished, they would never again make the mistake of thinking that someone's age, gender, or willingness to be generous meant they could be treated as disposable. The lesson Margaret was about to teach would change not just her relationship with her family, but her relationship with herself. She was about to discover that the most liberating feeling in the world is finally deciding that other people's opinion of your response to their mistreatment matters less than your own respect for your dignity. But the real magic of Margaret's story, more magical than anything Disney World has to offer, is that it shows us what's possible when we stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect we deserve. So make sure you're subscribed. Because Margaret's transformation is just getting started, and what happens next is going to surprise everyone, including Margaret herself. The abandoned grandmother is about to become the most powerful person in her family, and the most magical. Place on Earth is about to become the setting for the most strategic response to family mistreatment you've ever heard. Margaret Sinclair's Real Magic Show is about to begin. Now that you understand why Margaret's story matters to everyone watching this video, I want to dive deeper into something that most people never fully grasp until they find themselves in Margaret's situation. The difference between being genuinely loved and being conveniently used. Because what happened to Margaret at Disney World wasn't just about one afternoon of abandonment, it was the culmination of a psychological transformation that happens in millions of families around the world, where one person's value gets reduced to their utility and their dignity becomes negotiable as long as the benefits they provide remain intact. The stakes in Margaret's story extend far beyond one family's dynamics at a theme park. What we're really talking about here is a fundamental question that affects every relationship in your life. At what point do you stop accepting unacceptable behavior? At what point do you recognize that your attempts to maintain harmony are actually enabling other people's disrespect? And most crucially, at what point do you understand that the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're practical challenges that determine whether you live your life as someone who commands respect or someone who hopes for it. They determine whether your relationships are based on mutual consideration or one-sided accommodation. And they determine whether you teach people that treating you well is optional or required. Margaret's story demonstrates what happens when someone finally answers these questions decisively. But to understand why her response was so effective and why it created such dramatic change in her family dynamics, we need to understand something that most people never learn: the psychology of entitlement and how it develops in relationships, where one person consistently prioritizes everyone else's comfort over their own dignity. You see, David and Jessica hadn't started their marriage planning to exploit Margaret. In fact, during those early years when Margaret was helping with childcare and contributing to their financial security, they'd probably felt genuinely grateful for her support. The problem was that they'd gradually stopped thinking of Margaret's contributions as choices she was making and started thinking of them as services she provided. This transformation happens so slowly that the people involved rarely recognize it's occurring. It starts with appreciation for unexpected help. It progresses to anticipation of reliable support. Eventually, it reaches a point where the support is simply expected, and the person providing it is valued more for their utility than for their worth as an individual human being. The insidious nature of this progression is that each step feels reasonable in isolation. When Jessica asked Margaret to babysit Emma and Lucas so she and David could have a date night, that request probably felt normal and appropriate. When they began planning family activities around Margaret's availability, to help with childcare, that might have seemed like efficient family coordination. When they started making decisions about Margaret's involvement based on their convenience rather than her preferences, they probably told themselves they were just being practical. But what David and Jessica had actually done over the course of 3 years was systematically retrain themselves to think of Margaret as a resource rather than a person. They'd grown comfortable with making plans that assumed her availability without consulting her preferences. They'd developed habits of expecting her accommodation without offering reciprocal consideration. Most importantly, they'd convinced themselves that Margaret's role in their lives was to make things easier for them, rather than to be loved and respected as an individual with her own needs and dignity. This is why Margaret's attempts at communication had been so unsuccessful. When someone has unconsciously redefined your role as service provider rather than family member, your feedback about their treatment of you doesn't register as legitimate relationship concerns. Instead, it gets interpreted as complaints about job responsibilities or requests for appreciation that seem unreasonable given what they perceive as a mutually beneficial arrangement. David's response to Margaret's concerns about being abandoned at Disney World, telling her she was making a bigger deal out of this than necessary, perfectly illustrates this mindset. From David's perspective, Margaret had been asked to spend time with her grandchildren at Disney World, which should have been enjoyable for everyone involved. The fact that she felt abandoned and disrespected seemed like an overreaction to what he viewed as a minor logistical issue. But what David couldn't see, or chose not to see, was that Margaret hadn't agreed to serve as a babysitter during a vacation she'd funded. She'd expected to enjoy the parks as part of a family group, with everyone looking out for everyone else's needs and enjoyment. Instead, she'd been assigned responsibility for the children while David and Jessica enjoyed the attractions they wanted to experience without the burden of family obligations. The Disney World incident had crystallized something for Margaret that had been building for 3 years. The recognition that her family's love for her had become entirely conditional on her willingness to provide services while requiring minimal consideration in return. They loved the grandmother who babysat on demand, who contributed financially to their lifestyle, and who accommodated their schedules without complaint. But they had no patience for the woman who had her own needs, preferences, and expectations of respectful treatment. This realization is one of the most painful experiences a person can have, particularly when it involves family members who are supposed to love you unconditionally. It's the moment when you understand that the people you've sacrificed for don't actually see you as someone whose feelings matter as much as their convenience. It's when you recognize that your value in their lives is entirely tied to what you can do for them rather than who you are as a person. For many people, this recognition leads to a kind of desperate escalation where they try even harder to earn the love and respect they're missing. They become more accommodating, more generous, more available, hoping that if they just provide enough value, they'll eventually be treated with the consideration they deserve. But what they discover is that increasing their service doesn't increase their respect. It actually reinforces the dynamic that created the problem in the first place. Margaret's genius was recognizing that she couldn't earn respect from people who'd decided she didn't deserve it. Instead of trying harder to please David and Jessica, she made the strategic decision to demonstrate exactly what their lives looked like without the benefits they'd been taking for granted. But Margaret's response wasn't just about teaching her family a lesson, it was about reclaiming her own sense of worth and dignity. Over the 3 years since William's death, Margaret had gradually allowed herself to become smaller in deference to other people's comfort. She'd accepted less consideration, tolerated more disrespect, and accommodated more inconvenience because she'd been afraid that requiring better treatment might result in losing her family relationships entirely. What Margaret discovered that night in her Disney hotel room was something that many people never learn. That relationships based on fear of loss rather than mutual respect aren't actually worth preserving. That family connections maintained through constant accommodation and self-sacrifice aren't genuine connections at all. And that sometimes the most liberating thing you can do is stop being afraid of losing people who've already demonstrated they don't value you properly. The decision Margaret made to upgrade her Disney experience and share her story publicly represented a fundamental shift in how she understood her own power and worth. Instead of continuing to accept mistreatment because she was afraid of the consequences of demanding better, she decided to create consequences for people who treated her badly and see what happened next. This shift from fear-based accommodation to requirement-based boundaries is one of the most transformative decisions a person can make. It changes not just how others treat you, but how you see yourself and what you believe you deserve. It moves you from a position of hoping people will choose to treat you well to a position of requiring that they do so if they want to maintain access to your time, resources, and energy. But making this shift requires understanding something that our culture often doesn't teach us, particularly women and particularly older adults, that your comfort and dignity matter just as much as everyone else's, that your needs and preferences deserve consideration even when accommodating them requires other people to make adjustments, and that love without respect isn't actually love at all. It's exploitation disguised as family obligation. Margaret's story is particularly powerful because it demonstrates these principles in action. She didn't just talk about requiring respect. She created a situation where David and Jessica experienced real consequences for their disrespectful behavior. She didn't just express her feelings about being mistreated. She withdrew the benefits they'd been receiving while mistreating her. Most importantly, she didn't just hope they would change their behavior. She changed her own behavior in ways that made their previous treatment of her impossible to continue. The brilliance of Margaret's strategy was that it was entirely within her rights and completely proportional to the treatment she'd received. She hadn't done anything vindictive or cruel. She'd simply stopped providing financial support to people who demonstrated they didn't value the person providing it. She hadn't tried to punish them. She'd just removed herself from a dynamic that had become harmful to her dignity and self-respect. But the effectiveness of Margaret's response also demonstrates something crucial about power dynamics in relationships. That people who exploit others' kindness often have no idea how dependent they've become on that kindness until it disappears. David and Jessica had grown so accustomed to Margaret's financial contributions and emotional accommodation that they'd stopped thinking of these things as gifts she was choosing to provide. Instead, they'd unconsciously come to see them as natural features of their relationship with her. This is why Margaret's withdrawal of support was so shocking to them. They weren't just losing financial benefits. They were having to confront the reality that their comfortable lifestyle had been dependent on maintaining a respectful relationship with someone they'd been treating disrespectfully. They were discovering that the grandmother they'd dismissed as inconvenient was actually indispensable to the life they'd been enjoying. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. David and Jessica had to simultaneously recognize that they'd been mistreating someone they claimed to love, acknowledge that their behavior had been unacceptable, and accept that the consequences of their actions were entirely their own responsibility. They couldn't blame Margaret for being too sensitive or overreacting, because her response was completely logical and proportional. More importantly, they had to confront the fact that Margaret had been choosing to be generous and accommodating, not because she had no other options, but because she'd wanted to support their family. The moment they made that support unpleasant for her, she'd simply chosen to stop providing it. This realization forced them to understand that all of Margaret's previous accommodations had been gifts, not obligations, and that they'd been taking those gifts for granted while treating the gift giver with increasing disrespect. For viewers watching Margaret's story, the stakes are both personal and universal. On a personal level, this story challenges you to examine your own relationships and ask yourself, are there people in your life who've grown comfortable taking your kindness for granted? Are you providing support, accommodation, or resources to people who don't reciprocate consideration for your needs and feelings? Have you convinced yourself that maintaining peace requires accepting treatment that diminishes your dignity? On a universal level, Margaret's story represents a broader cultural shift in how we think about family obligations, particularly regarding older adults and particularly regarding women who've spent their lives prioritizing other people's needs. The old model suggested that love meant endless accommodation, that family loyalty required accepting any level of treatment, and that maintaining relationships was always more important than maintaining self-respect. Margaret's story suggests a different model, that genuine love includes mutual respect, that family loyalty should be reciprocal rather than one-sided, and that relationships worth maintaining are relationships where everyone's dignity is protected. This model doesn't require perfection from anyone, but it does require basic consideration and appreciation for the people who contribute to your life. The transformation we're about to witness in Margaret's story isn't just about one woman standing up to entitled family members. It's about what becomes possible when people stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect they deserve. It's about the power that comes from understanding your own worth and refusing to negotiate that worth based on other people's convenience. But Margaret's story also demonstrates something else that's crucial for anyone considering similar action in their own lives: the importance of being prepared for people to test your boundaries. When someone who's been exploiting your kindness suddenly faces consequences for their behavior, their first response is rarely acceptance and apology. Instead, they typically try to convince you that your expectations are unreasonable, your boundaries are selfish, and your consequences are unfair. This is exactly what David and Jessica would attempt to do when they realized Margaret was serious about changing the dynamics of their relationship. They would try to minimize the significance of their behavior, appeal to Margaret's love for her grandchildren, and pressure her to return to the previous arrangement where she provided benefits while they provided minimal consideration in return. Margaret's ability to maintain her new boundaries in the face of this pressure would determine whether her strategic response created lasting change or temporary inconvenience. and that ability would depend on something she'd been building her entire life without fully realizing it. The deep conviction that her dignity was not negotiable, regardless of who was asking her to compromise it. The woman who'd grown up watching. Her immigrant parents built respect through consistency and integrity, who'd married a man who treated her as an equal partner, and who'd raised a son to value character over convenience, had always possessed the strength to require respectful treatment. What had changed wasn't Margaret's capacity for demanding respect. It was her willingness to do so even when the disrespect was coming from people she loved. This distinction is crucial because it reveals something important about Margaret's transformation. She wasn't becoming a different person. She was finally allowing herself to be the person she'd always been. She wasn't developing new skills. She was applying skills she'd always possessed to a situation where she'd previously chosen accommodation over assertion. The power Margaret was about to demonstrate had always been there. What was new was her decision to use it instead of hiding it in deference to other people's comfort. And that decision would change not just how David and Jessica treated her, but how she understood her own capacity to shape the relationships and circumstances of her life. The abandoned grandmother was about to become a woman who commanded respect, not because she demanded it, but because she required it as the natural price of access to her time, energy, and resources. And David and Jessica were about to learn that taking someone for granted isn't a sustainable strategy when that someone has options, resources, and the wisdom that comes from 7 decades of understanding exactly how relationships are supposed to work. Margaret Sinclair's real education was about to begin. Not for her, but for the family members who'd forgotten that love without respect isn't love at all. The most magical place on earth was about to become the setting for the most important lesson David and Jessica would ever learn about the difference between being genuinely loved and being conveniently used. And Margaret was about to discover that the most empowering feeling in the world is finally deciding that teaching people how to treat you is more important than protecting them from the consequences of treating you badly. That Tuesday night in her modest Disney resort room, Margaret Catherine Sinclair opened her laptop and began what would become the most strategic and transformative 48 hours of her life. But before I tell you exactly what she did and how it completely reversed the power dynamics in her family, I want you to understand that what happened next wasn't driven by anger, revenge, or wounded pride. What Margaret executed was a carefully calculated demonstration of consequences, a masterclass in teaching people that their actions have direct, unavoidable results. The first thing Margaret did was research. For 3 hours, she explored Disney's VIP services, luxury accommodations, and exclusive experiences. She discovered that the Grand Floridian Presidential Suite, a 1,800-square-foot luxury accommodation with butler service, private balcony, and direct park access, was available for the remainder of the week at $3,200 per night. She learned about Disney's VIP tour guides, private dining experiences with Disney executives, and exclusive behind-the-scenes access that most guests never even know exists. But Margaret wasn't just planning a luxurious vacation upgrade. She was designing a visual demonstration of exactly what David and Jessica had taken for granted and what they were about to lose. Every element of her plan was carefully chosen to illustrate a specific point about respect, appreciation, and the consequences of treating generous people as expendable resources. At 11:47 p.m., Margaret called the Grand Floridian concierge. "This is Margaret Sinclair," she said with the confidence that comes from having $2.3 million in assets and the wisdom to use them strategically. "I'd like to upgrade to the presidential suite for the remainder of my stay, and I need to arrange several exclusive experiences. Money is no object, and I need this handled immediately." Within 30 minutes, Margaret had secured the presidential suite, arranged for a private VIP tour guide for the next day, booked dinner with Disney's customer experience executives, and scheduled a private photography session to document her upgraded Disney experience. The total cost for her 3 remaining days would be over $15,000, exactly the amount David had been panicking about spending on their originally planned Disney cruise. But Margaret's strategy went beyond just upgrading her own experience. At Hawaii, 12:30 a.m., she called her bank and initiated a series of financial moves that would demonstrate exactly how much of David and Jessica's comfortable lifestyle had been dependent on her generosity. She canceled the automatic transfers that had been funding Emma and Lucas's college accounts. Contributions of $2,000 per month per child that David and Jessica had apparently forgotten were coming from Margaret's resources rather than their own savings. She froze the credit line she'd established for David and Jessica's home renovations, a $50,000 credit facility that had allowed them to upgrade their kitchen, remodel their master bedroom, and install the pool that had made their house the neighborhood gathering spot for other families. Most significantly, she canceled the automatic payment for the Disney cruise she'd been secretly funding, a $25,000 family vacation scheduled for the following month that David and Jessica had been looking forward to for 6 months. Margaret also sent a brief professional email to David and Jessica's financial advisor, a family friend who'd been managing some joint investments. Please note that effective immediately, I'll be withdrawing from all shared financial arrangements with David and Jessica Martinez. I'll be working with my own advisor going forward to manage my assets independently. Thank you for your previous assistance. But the masterstroke of Margaret's strategy was her decision to document and share her upgraded Disney experience publicly. At 1:15 a.m., she created an Instagram account called A Magical Margaret 73 and crafted her first post with the kind of strategic precision that comes from understanding exactly how to make a point that can't be ignored. The post featured a photo of her modest Disney resort room with a caption that would soon go viral. After being abandoned at Space Mountain today by my son and daughter-in-law, who I was funding this entire Disney vacation for, I decided to show myself what real Disney magic looks like. Tomorrow, I'm moving to the presidential suite at Grand Floridian and treating myself to the VIP experience I always deserved. Sometimes the best family is the one you create by valuing yourself. Disney magic. Know your worth. Senior power. What Margaret understood, and what David and Jessica were about to learn, was that in today's social media world, public accountability creates pressure that private conversations never can. Margaret wasn't trying to shame her family into better behavior. She was creating a situation where their treatment of her would become visible to their community, their friends, and their professional networks. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of Florida sunshine that makes everything seem possible. Margaret woke up in her modest room for the last time, ordered room service breakfast, charged to David and Jessica's room naturally, and began preparing for her transformation from abandoned grandmother to Disney VIP. At 9 a.m., a Disney representative arrived to personally escort Margaret to her new accommodations. The presidential suite was everything the website had promised and more. A stunning space with views of Magic Kingdom, a private balcony where she could watch the fireworks, and amenities that made her previous accommodations look like a budget motel. Margaret's private VIP tour guide, a Disney cast member named Sarah who specialized in creating magical experiences for distinguished guests, arrived at 10 a.m. with an itinerary that would take Margaret through every park with no waiting, private character meet and greets, and behind-the-scenes access to areas most guests never see. But the real magic began when Margaret started documenting her experience. Her second Instagram post, featuring her in the presidential suite with Mickey Mouse ears and a champagne glass, attracted attention immediately. Day 1 in the presidential suite. My private VIP guide Sarah is taking me on exclusive tours today. It's amazing how much more magical Disney becomes when you're treated with the respect you deserve. My son and daughter-in-law are somewhere in the parks, wondering why their credit cards aren't working. VIP treatment. Respect your elders' magical upgrade. By 11 a.m., Margaret's posts were being shared by her friends from Golden Oaks, who were delighted to see her standing up for herself. By noon, Local Orlando social media accounts had picked up her story. By 2 p.m., her posts had been shared over 1,000 times, with comments pouring in from people who related to her experience of being taken for granted by family members. Meanwhile, David and Jessica were discovering the immediate consequences of Margaret's strategic response. Their first indication that something had changed came when Jessica tried to use the credit card Margaret had been paying for to buy lunch at Epcot. The card was declined. When David called the credit card company, he learned that the account had been closed by the primary cardholder, his mother. Their second shock came when they tried to check their bank account and discovered that the automatic transfers they'd been receiving for Emma and Lucas's college funds had been canceled. The accounts were still accessible, but no new money would be added unless David and Jessica began making the contributions themselves. The third and most devastating discovery came when Jessica checked her email and found a message from their travel agent. "I'm sorry to inform you that your Disney cruise reservation has been canceled due to non-payment. The credit card on file has been declined, and the cancellation fee has been charged to the account as per the terms of your booking." By 3 p.m. Wednesday, David was frantically calling Margaret's phone. She let each call go to voicemail, then listened to increasingly desperate messages that revealed exactly how much David and Jessica's financial stability had depended on Margaret's quiet generosity. "Mom, there seems to be some kind of problem with the credit cards and the bank transfers. Can you call me back so we can figure out what's going on? Mom, the travel agent says our cruise has been canceled. There must be some mistake. Please call me back right away. Mom, I know you're upset about yesterday, but we need to talk. This is affecting Emma and Lucas's future. Please call me back." That evening, Margaret attended her private dinner with Disney's customer experience executives, a behind-the-scenes experience that costs $500 per person and typically requires months of advance planning. She dined on gourmet cuisine while discussing Disney's commitment to creating magical experiences for guests of all ages, and she made sure to document the entire evening for her growing social media audience. Her Instagram post from the dinner went viral overnight. "Having dinner with Disney executives tonight, discussing how they create magic for guests who appreciate being treated well. They're fascinated by my story of upgrading after being abandoned by family." One executive said, "Mrs. Sinclair, Disney magic is about treating every guest like family." I told him, "That's exactly the problem. My family forgot how to treat me like family." Disney executives, treated like family, knowing your worth. By Thursday morning, Margaret's story had been picked up by local news stations, senior advocacy groups, and social media accounts dedicated to family dynamics and elder rights. Her Instagram following had grown to over 50,000 people, with comments from viewers sharing their own stories of being taken for granted by family members. The viral nature of Margaret's story created exactly the kind of public pressure that David and Jessica couldn't ignore. Their friends, neighbors, and professional contacts were seeing Margaret's posts and asking questions. Jessica's colleagues at the marketing firm where she worked were commenting on the situation. David's business associates were sharing the story and making observations about family values and respecting parents. More importantly, Emma and Lucas's friends at school had parents who were following Margaret's story, which meant the children were hearing comments and questions about why their grandmother was staying at Disney World alone instead of with their family. The public nature of the situation made it impossible for David and Jessica to simply wait for Margaret to get over her feelings and return to the previous arrangement. Thursday afternoon brought Margaret's most strategic move yet. She arranged for a professional photography session in the Cinderella Castle Suite, an exclusive dining experience that typically requires 6 months advance planning and costs $600 per person. The photos showed Margaret in an elegant dress, dining on gourmet cuisine while surrounded by Disney's most iconic setting. Her Instagram post from the Castle Suite became her most viral content yet. "Lunch in Cinderella Castle today. a dream I've had since childhood but never thought I'd experience. My son used to tell me these exclusive experiences were too expensive and not worth it. Turns out he was wrong about both. Sometimes you have to treat yourself to the magic you deserve, especially when the people you've been treating to magic don't appreciate the person providing it. Cinderella Castle. Dreams come true. Worth it. The post was shared over 10,000 times within 6 hours, with major social media accounts featuring Margaret's story as an example of senior empowerment and the importance of self-advocacy. Comments poured in from people praising Margaret's courage, sharing their own stories of family mistreatment, and celebrating her decision to prioritize her own happiness. But the most significant development came Thursday evening, when David and Jessica finally appeared at the Grand Floridian, having spent the day tracking down Margaret's location and working up the courage to confront their new reality. Margaret was on her private balcony, watching the Magic Kingdom fireworks with a glass of champagne, when the concierge called to inform her that her son and daughter-in-law were in the lobby requesting to speak with her. "Please inform them that I'm enjoying a private VIP fireworks viewing experience," Margaret told the concierge with the kind of calm authority that comes from finally understanding your own power. "If they'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss their treatment of me, they can contact my assistant." "Your assistant, Mrs. Sinclair?" "Yes, please give them this number." Margaret provided the contact information for Diana Walsh, her estate planning attorney, whom she'd briefed earlier that day about the situation and who'd agreed to mediate any discussions about restoring financial arrangements. The message was clear. Margaret was no longer available for desperate phone calls, emotional manipulation, or pressure to return to arrangements that had become harmful to her dignity. If David and Jessica wanted to discuss restoring their financial relationship, they would need to go through proper channels and acknowledge that Margaret was someone whose time and attention required respectful requesting rather than demanding. Friday morning brought the confrontation that would determine whether Margaret's strategic response created lasting change or temporary inconvenience. David and Jessica, having spent a sleepless night in their modest Disney resort room while Margaret enjoyed luxury accommodations 30 floors above them, finally understood the full scope of what they'd lost and what they needed to do to have any hope of restoring it. The meeting took place in Diana Walsh's temporary office at the Grand Floridian, a conference room the attorney had arranged for the purpose of facilitating what she described as family financial mediation. Margaret arrived in an elegant outfit purchased from the hotel's boutique, carrying herself with the confidence that comes from finally understanding that her dignity was not negotiable. David and Jessica arrived looking exhausted, stressed, and humbled in a way that Margaret had never seen before. For the first time in 3 years, they were approaching her as supplicants, rather than assuming they could take her cooperation for granted. "Mom," David began. But Diana Walsh interrupted, with the professional authority that Margaret had hired her to provide. "Mrs. Sinclair," Diana said, "you've asked me to facilitate this discussion about the financial arrangements you'd been providing for your son's family, and whether those arrangements might be restored under different terms. Would you like to begin by explaining the circumstances that led to your decision to discontinue your previous support?" For the next hour, Margaret calmly and methodically detailed 3 years of systematic marginalization, culminating in the Disney World abandonment that had finally convinced her that David and Jessica valued her resources more than they respected her person. She explained how her attempts to address these issues through conversation had been dismissed, minimized, and ignored. Most importantly, she described how she'd finally understood that continuing to provide financial support to people who treated her disrespectfully was actually enabling their harmful behavior rather than encouraging them to change it. David and Jessica listened in stunned silence as Margaret's attorney presented documentation of the financial support that had been quietly funding their lifestyle. $4,000 per month in college fund contributions, $50,000 in home renovation credit, monthly payments on credit cards they'd assumed were being handled by their bank's automatic payment system, and the $25,000 Disney cruise that had been canceled when Margaret withdrew her support. The total annual value of Mrs. Sinclair's financial contributions to your family, Diana explained with devastating precision, has been approximately $78,000 per year for the past 3 years. This doesn't include the $200,000 gift that helped you purchase your current home, or the numerous smaller contributions for vacations, children's activities, and other expenses. The numbers created a silence that stretched for several minutes as David and Jessica confronted the reality of how dependent their comfortable lifestyle had become on Margaret's generosity. Generosity they'd been taking for granted while treating her with increasing disrespect. "I want to be very clear about something," Margaret said when the silence became uncomfortable. "This isn't about money. You're both intelligent, capable adults who can build a good life without my financial support. This is about respect. This is about recognizing that relationships require mutual consideration, even when one person is in a position to be more generous than the other." Jessica spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Margaret, we had no idea how much you were contributing. We thought you were just helping out occasionally." "No," Margaret replied with the kind of gentle firmness that comes from finally speaking truth without worrying about other people's comfort. "You knew exactly how much I was contributing. You chose not to think about it because thinking about it would have required acknowledging that your treatment of me was unacceptable." David tried to defend their behavior. "Mom, we never meant to take advantage of you. We just got busy with work and the kids, and maybe we didn't express our appreciation as much as we should have." "David," Margaret said, looking directly at the son she'd raised to value character over convenience. "You abandoned me at Disney World. You left me sitting with 2 tired children for hours while you enjoyed attractions without giving a single thought to our well-being. When I tried to explain how that felt, you told me I was making too big a deal of it. That wasn't poor communication. That was a complete lack of respect for my dignity as a person." Diana Walsh then presented the terms under which Margaret might consider restoring some level of financial support. The terms were simple but non-negotiable. David and Jessica would need to demonstrate through their actions, not just their words, that they understood Margaret's worth as a person rather than just her utility as a resource. This would require scheduled, regular family time where Margaret's preferences and enjoyment were prioritized equally with everyone else's. It would require consultation about plans that affected her rather than assumption of her availability. Most importantly, it would require acknowledgement that Margaret's contributions were choices she was making, not obligations she owed them. "Mrs. Sinclair is willing to consider gradually restoring some financial support," Diana explained, "but only if she sees consistent evidence that your family's treatment of her has fundamentally changed. This isn't about perfect behavior. It's about basic respect and consideration." The meeting ended with David and Jessica understanding that their relationship with Margaret would never return to the previous arrangement, where they could take her generosity for granted while providing minimal consideration in return. If they wanted to rebuild a financial relationship with Margaret, they would need to first rebuild a respectful personal relationship with her. Over the following months, David and Jessica had to learn how to treat Margaret as someone whose feelings mattered as much as their convenience. They had to discover that appreciation needed to be expressed regularly and meaningfully, not just assumed. Most importantly, they had to understand that love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation, disguised as family obligation. The changes weren't immediate or perfect. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted permanently. Margaret was no longer someone who hoped for respect. She was someone who required it as the price of access to her time, energy, and resources. 6 months after the Disney World transformation, Emma and Lucas were thriving in their new dynamic with their grandmother. Instead of taking her availability for granted, they learned to appreciate the special time they spent with her. Instead of seeing her as convenient childcare, they began to understand her as someone with her own interesting life, experiences, and wisdom to share. David had to confront some difficult truths about how he'd allowed his marriage to affect his relationship with his mother. He began creating space for one-on-one time with Margaret, separate from Jessica's influence and expectations. Most importantly, he learned to advocate for his mother's dignity, even when that advocacy created inconvenience for his wife. Jessica's transformation was the most dramatic and the most necessary. She had to recognize that her treatment of Margaret had been guided by self-interest rather than family love. She had to learn that appreciating someone's contributions meant considering their feelings, not just benefiting from their generosity. Most challenging of all, she had to accept that Margaret's value to their family wasn't dependent on her utility to their lifestyle. The Disney cruise was eventually rescheduled, but this time, David and Jessica paid for it themselves, and the itinerary was planned around activities that everyone would enjoy rather than just the younger family members. Margaret's presence was valued rather than assumed, and her preferences were consulted rather than ignored. Margaret's Instagram account, Magical Margaret 73, continued to inspire people around the world who were dealing with similar family dynamics. Her posts about setting boundaries, requiring respect, and understanding your own worth resonated with thousands of people who'd been struggling with exploitative relationships. But more importantly, Margaret had discovered something about herself that changed how she approached every relationship in her life. That teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel or selfish, it's necessary. That requiring respect doesn't damage good relationships, it preserves them. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted. The woman who'd been abandoned at Space Mountain had become someone who commanded respect, not through demands or manipulation, but through the simple act of valuing herself enough to require that others value her too. Margaret Sinclair had learned that real magic isn't about waving wands or making wishes. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't reflect that worth. Her story became a reminder that age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of understanding exactly how relationships are supposed to work. And sometimes, the most magical transformation of all is finally deciding that your dignity is worth more than other people's comfort. Margaret's Disney World experience had indeed been magical, not because of the VIP tours or luxury accommodations, but because it had been the setting for her transformation from someone who hoped for respect to someone who required it. And that transformation had changed not just her relationship with her family, but her relationship with herself. The most magical place on earth had become the place where Margaret Catherine Sinclair finally learned the most important lesson of all: that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept, and that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the natural consequence of their own behavior. If you've made it this far in Margaret's story, I want you to remember something. You have more power than you realize to change the dynamics in your own relationships. You don't have to accept disrespect from people just because you love them. You don't have to continue providing benefits to people who don't appreciate the person providing them. And you definitely don't have to sacrifice your dignity to maintain relationships that aren't based on mutual respect. Margaret's story isn't just about one woman's triumph over entitled family members. It's about what becomes possible when you finally decide that your worth isn't negotiable, regardless of who's asking you to compromise it. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because Margaret's story is just one example of what happens when people stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect they deserve. And in the comments below, tell me about your own experiences with setting boundaries and requiring respect. Your stories matter, And they might just inspire someone else to find their own courage to transform from someone who hopes for better treatment to someone who requires it. Remember, you are worth more than you've been accepting. You deserve better than you've been receiving. And sometimes, the most magical transformation of all is finally believing that truth enough to act on it. The magic was inside Margaret all along. She just had to decide to use it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.